Back at the beginning of this festival, Diana Beresford Kroger at the opening program had a word to say about the Irish myth of Tier Na Nog, the land of eternal youth. And she gave me an amazing perspective that I wanted to share. She offered to us that the Irish sailors visited Turtle Island, also known as North America, at least a millennium before Columbus. And Tier Na Nog was North America. That was the origin of the myth. So I'm going to keep that in mind when I tell you the story of Tier Na Nog. The land of eternal youth was known to many nations, and the Irish people called it Tier Na Nog. Tier Na Nog was the most perfect place in the world. The young men and young women who were invited to live there because of their exemplary character stayed in the glory and the bloom of their youth forever. Everyone lived in luxury. The land was rich and abundant with dense forests and the richest farmland. No hardship or difficulty of any sort was allowed in Tier Na Nog. Even the weather was perfect, never too hot and never too cold. The king of Tier Na Nog was the sea god Manannán mac Lir. He had a daughter, the princess Niamh, who was the flower of Tier Na Nog, the most beautiful woman in a land populated by beautiful women and beautiful men. Niamh was a bold, adventurous woman, and I'm going to say a lot more about her. But for a moment, I want to leave Tier Na Nog. I'm going to take us to Alween in Leinster Province in Ireland. This was the home of the celebrated warrior Finn McCool. Finn was a patriot, a valiant fighter on behalf of the Irish people. He led a fighting force called the Fianna. They were named after him, and they were made up of the finest men in the land, not just in fighting skill, but in good character. The Fianna were such a formidable fighting force that enemies of Ireland didn't dare invade. So Ireland got to enjoy a period of peace and prosperity during the time of Finn's leadership. Finn had a son named Ossian, and you could say Ossian was the finest of the finest, unmatched in strength and courage, highly honored by the Irish people, and highly respected by his colleagues in the Fianna. Now, the fighters in the Fianna had to be more than fighters. They had to be a master of the gentle arts. The Fianna included singers, harp players, storytellers. Ossian's specialty was poetry. He wrote beautiful, stirring epics about the history of the people, and he could keep an audience spellbound for hours reciting one of his epic poems. In Tier Na Nog, Niamh was restless. She would sometimes visit the land of the mortal people because she was just too adventurous. She traveled across the water in a magic white horse that galloped out to the places where the mortal people lived. And when she was outside of Tier Na Nog, she had to remember not to get off the horse, because if she put her feet down on the ground, she couldn't return. In the land of the mortal people, she heard many stories about Finn and the Fianna, their acts of chivalry, their prowess on the battlefield, and she heard many stories about Ossian. One day she was out in the forest and she saw Ossian out hunting. It was one of his favorite pastimes. When she saw him, she knew that everything they said about him was true. The power in his physical form was without a doubt. And his face spoke of character and good breeding. It seemed to be written all over him. She listened to Ossian recite poetry, and she was overwhelmed by the power of his words. Niamh fell in love with Oisin, and she made a bold plan. One day, the Fianna were out on the coast, roasting fish that they caught and enjoying good camaraderie. And they saw a fantastic sight, unlike anything they'd ever seen before. It was a magic white horse galloping over the water, and as it approached, they could see it was being ridden by the most beautiful woman they'd ever seen. She was wearing a dress of yellow silk. She had flowers braided in her long red hair. She stopped the horse on the shore, and the fighters stood there, their jaws dropping, unable to say anything, actually looking quite foolish. But Finn took charge. He stepped up and said, "And what brings you here, beautiful woman?" Niamh said, "I'm Niamh, the daughter of the king of Tier Na Nog. I'm here to ask you for the hand of your son Oisin in marriage. I have fallen very much in love with him. I want to take him back to the wonderful land I live in and let him enjoy all the luxury that will be his. He will love every part of it, and he will have total freedom." Well, Finn looked at his son and said, "What do you have to say, son? It's your choice." Oisin was just taking all of this in, and he was very much falling in love with the beautiful woman before him. And he said, "Yes, father, I want to go across the water and visit Tier Na Nog. I promise I won't stay there forever. I will return and I will tell all of the Fianna about Tier Na Nog. No one has ever gone to Tier Na Nog and returned, and I think it would be very appropriate if one of the Fianna had that honor." And when Finn heard those words, his heart sank. He knew he'd never see his son again. Oisin insisted he would return. He got on the back of the horse behind the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, and they set off across the water. I can't say how far they traveled because no one knows where Tier Na Nog was. But when the land came into view, it was stunning. It was a beautiful landscape. They passed through a dense forest full of wild game and wild flowers. They went down country roads and saw fields filled with the fattest cattle and other fields filled with golden wheat. They passed a castle that was covered with more gold than Oisin had ever seen in one place. Oisin exclaimed, "What a magnificent castle." And Niamh said very matter-of-factly, "That's the way everybody in Tier Na Nog lives. That's not even a relatively big castle." She took Oisin to the king's castle, and it was truly the most stunning dwelling place he'd seen. It was filled with gold and jewels. He walked down a sumptuous carpet, down halls that were covered with beautiful works of art. He went to the king, and the king said to his daughter, "You've chosen well. This is a fine young man." And he said to Oisin, "Settle in, enjoy yourself. You will love it here. You can do whatever you want. Play jousting games if that's your pleasure. Hunt, write poetry, enjoy the beautiful land." And it was as the king said. Oisin loved everything about Tier Na Nog, but the thing he loved the most was the time he spent with his beautiful bride. Niamh and Oisin were very much in love. Time passed. Lots of time passed. It was easy to forget about time in Tier Na Nog. Nothing ever changed because it was perfect. Why change perfection? And after a number of years, Oisin started to get troubled. He went to Niamh and said, It's been 10 long years, and I haven't seen my father. He doesn't know where I am. I promised I'd return. There was a druid who kept records. He was a part of this conversation. And he said to Oisin, actually, you haven't lived here for 10 years. You've lived here for 300 years. And Oisin's heart sank. He knew his father was long dead, but he still had a burning desire to return to Ireland. And he was very stubborn about it. Niamh couldn't talk him out of it, even though she had great misgiving about seeing him leave Tier Na Nog. But she supplied him with the magic horse, reminded him not to get off of it, and he was on his way, galloping over the water. And as Ireland came into view again, his heart jumped for joy. His beloved homeland, the land he loved so much. When he got on the shore and started to travel around, his joy turned to a note of dismay. The land didn't seem to have the vitality it had, and the people didn't seem to have the same spirit. He talked to a few people about Finn and the Fianna, and they said, oh, yes, we love those folk tales. We tell them to our children. And Oisin was really hurt by that. The finest men in the history of the land have been reduced to folk tales. He told the people about the gods they worshipped, Lu and Lear, and the goddesses Eru and Morrigan, and the people were horrified. Those are the pagan gods. We don't have those anymore. We have one God. Don't say the names of the pagan gods. The priest will have you put to death. And Oisin scoffed at the thought that he was in any danger. He wanted to see his castle, and he went out to it. And when he arrived at the familiar place, there was no castle. There was a pile of rubble overgrown with weeds and nettles. What a sad sight. And back in Tier Na Nog, Niamh felt sad too. Even though they were separated by great distance, they were so close in their hearts. She felt what he felt. This was turning into a very sad trip, and Oisin continued on his way. He saw a group of workers trying to move a boulder. They pushed, and they couldn't make the boulder move. And Oisin was appalled. What happened to the vigorous men that he remembered? The men saw Oisin on horseback, and they caught their breath. He was the most magnificent frame of a man that they'd ever seen. His power was completely apparent. And he said, do you need some help? And he picked the boulder up with his two arms. The men were just awestruck. They'd never seen such a show of strength. And Oisin said, and where do you want this boulder moved? They pointed to the place. And Oisin tossed the boulder through the air. It took every bit of strength in his powerful frame. He had to push down hard in his stirrups to get the traction. And he pushed so hard, he broke one of his stirrups and fell off the horse, and his feet touched. Who marveled at his strength just minutes earlier, marveled again, but this time in a horrible way. When Oisin touched the ground, he lost the gift of eternal youth. He aged 300 years right before their eyes. Now, he had the wisdom of age, but the vigor of youth was completely gone. The horse ran away from him and returned to Tier Na Nog. And when Niamh saw the riderless horse, she knew she would never see her true love again. She cried and cried. The blackness in her heart filled every part of her. She didn't know that this was called grief. She never experienced anything like this before. In Ireland, Ossian didn't have long to live after that, and the people were good enough to give him a burial in his beloved homeland. But one question remains. What happened to Tier Na Nog after grief came to visit it for the first time? I don't know the answer to that, but I think Tier Na Nog moved even further away from the places that mortal humans inhabited.